Hey everyone, welcome back to Let's Talk. My name is John, and today here on the channel we're going to be counting down all of David Fincher's films from worst to first. But before we dive into that, if you are a fan of 4K Blu-ray reviews, movie reviews, lists like this, some tech and game reviews, and now we do podcasts. If you're a fan of all that, then this is the channel for you. And nothing helps this channel out more than by you liking this video and subscribing to the channel. So David Fincher, he's considered one of the greatest directors of all time, but yet he doesn't get brought up in the conversation with a lot of other great directors like Martin Scorsese, Spike Lee. He kind of seems to be the forgotten great, and that's a real shame because this guy easily has at least 3 masterpieces in his filmography, some other films that people just absolutely love, and then there's one in there that, you know, it's alright, I guess. So we'll dive into all those in a minute, but David Fincher actually got his original start making music videos and for working at Industrial Light and Magic before he transitioned into film, and he actually directed such great music videos as George Michael's Freedom 90. So this guy always had an eye for film, but even though he didn't go to film school, I feel like what he learned, and even he's admitted when he learned about making music videos, helped him learn to make films. And you can see that on screen in the fact that all of his movies are very clean looking. The production design is never anything less than a 10, even in movies that you might not consider great. The costume design, the production design, the set design, all the cinematography, it always looks clean. It always looks like it's polished up and beautiful. There has never been a complaint about David Fincher's cinematography on all of his films. Whoever he partners up with, they always turn out a good looking film, one that always is slick and clean and beautiful and can transport you to another time and place. I think that's one thing that David Fincher has done in all of his films, no matter if you think they're good or bad. But since 1992, he's been delivering some great films to us, and he's also delivered some great TV shows like Mindhunter and House of Cards. So David Fincher could do it all, but what he's most known for are these 11 films, and right now I'm going to count them down from worst to first, starting with number 11.
The suspense is back.
And we have no weapons of any kind?
And number 11 is most people's worst David Fincher film, and that's because it's Alien 3. This was a director-for-hire film. He was actually hired at last minute to replace another director. I believe they said there was 9 writers making this movie. It was just all chopped together, which is a real shame because the first 2 Alien movies are both considered classics and masterpieces. And I mean, hey, you go from Ridley Scott to James Cameron to David Fincher. It seems like a match made in heaven. But unfortunately, studio interference can ruin a movie, and as David Fincher says, nobody hates Alien 3 more than him. And I actually think he's being a little too hard on himself for this movie. This movie is definitely not great, but it's also not the worst movie you've ever seen. It's passable. There's some good acting in here. Sigourney Weaver definitely doesn't hold back. But there's also another great performance in here that never gets brought up. If you've ever seen Game of Thrones and you've seen Tyrion Lannister, then that actor is Charles Dance. And Charles Dance has a great performance in Alien 3, one that I truly loved. His scenes with Sigourney Weaver I thought were the best scenes in the entire film. And some of the alien effects were good, and the set design is perfect. It has like this burnt orange, amber look to it. Everything looks decayed and gross because it takes place on a prison planet. You know, unfortunately, I think what most people get caught up with is just the narrative. We kill off Newt and Bishop from the previous movie immediately, so there was never even a chance that we were going to get those characters in this movie. But we do get Sigourney Weaver back playing Ridley, and she does a phenomenal job, even though in this movie she's practically begging to kill herself. And it actually reminded me of Forky from Toy Story 4 while I was rewatching it this time. Like, he always just wants to throw himself in the trash because he's trash. Sigourney Weaver in this movie just seems like desperate to die. And of course, in the very end of this movie, if you haven't seen it, she does die. And there is a recut of this movie, but David Fincher, despite what people may say, had no involvement in that. He's pretty much disowned this film since it came out. He just, he had a horrible experience with Fox, unfortunately, making this movie. So he doesn't really like to talk about this movie at all anymore. And I rewatched it, and it's just okay. It's definitely his worst film, and that's just because it's nothing special to it. It just feels like a generic film without that Fincher touch. Even though you could see his fingerprints on there, but nothing more than that. It's just a generic Alien movie. Unfortunately, that's basically what we've gotten since Aliens.
This is Herman Mankiewicz, but we're to call him Mank.
Mankiewicz.
And at number 10, we have Mank, 2020's Mank that came out on Netflix. This one was actually written by David Fincher's father, Jack Fincher, so this is a very personal tale for him, and it tells the story of Herman J. Mankiewicz, the co-writer of Citizen Kane. Despite what many people believe, Orson Welles didn't just write that alone. I believe Pauline Kael actually brought this to the attention of the world back in the 70s when she was talking about the fact that, Orson Welles kind of took all the credit for this movie, even though Herman J. Mankiewicz wrote this movie. So this movie is explaining that tale about Herman J. Mankiewicz. Mankiewicz, a writer who is struggling with alcohol addiction and basically is just not the same man. But Orson Welles needs his help to write this movie, Citizen Kane, and Amanda Seyfried both give world-class performances, earned them both Academy Award nominations, no wins, but still great performances. This movie is shot in beautiful black and white. It looks gorgeous. The story itself, though, is just not the greatest, and we know how this story ends up, so you're really just there for this beautiful production design and hoping for some great performances throughout. I just wasn't as wrapped up in this as other David Fincher movies. I wanted to love this movie. I still enjoyed this movie. It just feels like it's missing a little bit of something. It's not his best movie he's ever put out, but to make a movie and basically base it off of his father's script, that's special alone, and David Fincher, I'm sure, had a great time doing that, paying homage to his father, and telling a story that I'm sure a lot of people aren't aware even happened. I'm sure a lot of film fans, when they think of Citizen Kane, they think of Orson Welles, they don't even think about Herman J. Mankiewicz, so it's definitely a fun film. It's one you should check out. It's just not one of David Fincher's best.
They make your life fun.
And at number 9, we have The Game from 1997, starring Michael Douglas and Sean Penn, with a bunch of great little performances in there as well. This is his follow-up to 7, and this one he just goes full-fledged psychological thriller mode. This movie, it's not like the most story-oriented plot. We follow a rich person who just has nothing left in his life. He doesn't really have anything to live for. He's just a miserable man. He's got everything in the world. He's running a company, and then one day his brother shows up and gives him a birthday gift called The Game. And what is this game? Well, basically it flips his entire life upside down. He loses all of his money. His life is being threatened and he has no idea what's going on. Is this part of the game? And you get some world-class performances in here from Michael Douglas. And Michael Douglas is born to play roles like this. You've seen it in Fatal Attraction, the Wall Street movies. This is what Michael Douglas does best. He plays this uptight asshole who has to learn his lesson. And boy, if you've ever needed a lesson taught to you, nobody has had to learn a lesson like Michael Douglas has to learn a lesson in The Game. My God, what he gets put through. I don't feel too bad for him because this guy has all the money in the world, but, you kind of understand a person like that to get their life going again, to get out of this deep depression. You might need a shock to your system like the one he gets in this movie, and it really does build up to a very satisfying ending. I'm always surprised every time I watch this movie how much I enjoy the ending of this film. I think it's phenomenal. I mean, you have a lot of questions. You have to defy a lot of belief to believe the ending in this movie. But I love the message in there that, he needed this shot to his system just to really get him out of the funk that he was in. It really is a simple tale like this, told in such a beautiful way, with just, again, beautiful cinematography. The world looks great. It does feel like an in-between film of 7 and Fight Club, like the world that they created here. It does feel kind of like that, but it just doesn't hit the highs of those other two movies. This feels like more of a simple plot than what we're used to with David Fincher, but still has those thought-provoking scenes throughout. It just doesn't hit the highs of some of his other films.
Thieves, misers, bullies, the most detestable collection of people that you will ever meet.
And then at number 8, we have 2011's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And this movie is based on a series of books and actually had a planned trilogy in place. And as I was rewatching this film yesterday, it's weird because this film stars Daniel Craig as a private investigator. Well, he's a journalist, but he's basically playing a private investigator in this movie. He gets hired by Christopher Plummer to find out what happened to somebody in his family 40 years ago. She disappeared. Nobody in the rest of the family knows what happened, but Christopher Plummer hires him to investigate the rest of his family because he believes that one of them is involved in this. So when I was watching the movie, I thought, wow, this feels like a much more direct, down and dirty, grittier, more serious version than Knives Out. It is a murder mystery movie. We're trying to solve a murder in this film. It's just so funny that basically Daniel Craig and Christopher Plummer are playing very similar roles that they did in Knives Out, just very different films, but yet somehow have a very similar plot. So I thought that was pretty funny while I was rewatching it. And then obviously the star of this movie is Rooney Mara. She turns out a phenomenal performance in this movie. I think this is the reason why I was very disappointed that we didn't get more movies. We did get The Girl in the Spider's Web, but the less said about that, the better. David Fincher had no part of that. I really wanted to see. For some reason, David Fincher properties just don't get completed. We were supposed to get a trilogy of movies. I don't know how serious they were with that. I thought the box office performance warranted it, but I guess they said no. It's like the same thing with Mindhunter. We just don't get more of them. It's unfortunate, but it just doesn't happen. So if you just watch this movie in a bubble, it does kind of feel a little bit incomplete at the very, very, very end, but the story itself is still very satisfying. The mystery that unravels is phenomenal. And again, production design. This is a beautiful looking movie. It takes place in the European countryside. The snow is basically throughout. It's just a character in this film as well. It looks gorgeous. And then another thing that people just don't talk about in this movie, and it's a shame, is Stellan Skarsgård's performance in this movie. He gives a monologue at the very end of this movie that is up there with the best, and I feel like nobody ever talks about it. This movie, I think it's actually kind of underrated, but in David Fincher's filmography, it's crazy that this would probably be another director's best film that they ever put out. But in David Fincher's filmography, it's just another run-of-the-mill film, and that's crazy. This is the most recent rewatch for me, was this movie, and I'm like, wow, that's a damn good movie. It's a real shame that not more people talk about this, but you know what? When you have a great body of work like that, some of them have to fall to the wayside, unfortunately. And then at number 7, we have 2002's Panic Room, starring Jodie Foster, Kristen Stewart, Forest Whitaker, Dwight Yoakam, and a young Jared Leto. And this movie is another basic story. This is what David Fincher used to like. He just liked to create thrillers, and this is just a straightforward thriller. A mother and daughter buy a house in New York City, and it's got a panic room in it. And one night, their house starts to get robbed by 3 robbers, Dwight Yoakam, Forest Whitaker, and Jared Leto, and they hide in the panic room. And you create a lot of tension in the sense that Kristen Stewart's character has diabetes, Jodie Foster is going through a divorce from her father, and you get all these emotional moments while dealing with a robbery. And this movie also features a lot of great CGI, some of the best CGI you've ever seen in film, because David Fincher, again, knows how to shoot a movie. So some of the effects in this movie still stand the test of the time, even though this movie came out now 21 years ago. It's a beautiful looking movie. It's just a very straightforward plot with a very predictable ending. There's nothing really too special in here, except I think that the production design, the cinematography, and some world-class performances from a great actress like Jodie Foster and a young Kristen Stewart really helped to make this feel special. Now, Jared Leto doesn't turn in the greatest performance, but Dwight Yoakam, he really does turn in a very surprising performance. And if you don't know who Dwight Yoakam is, he was a very famous country singer back in the 80s.
Guitars, Cadillacs, hillbilly music.
He's transitioned to an actor, and you've probably seen him in such movies as Wedding Crashers at the very beginning. But man, for a country singer, that's a great performance that he puts on in this movie. And this movie is just a lot of fun. Again, it's just one of those movies that David Fincher just put out that would be another director's best film. But for him, it's just a run-of-the-mill movie that David Fincher put out that is just a good time to watch.
You really don't like him, do you?
All I'm trying to do is be nice to the people who are volunteering to help find Amy.
And at number 6, you have Gone Girl, starring Ben Affleck and Rosamund Pike. These two play a married couple, and one day, Rosamund Pike's character, well, she disappears. And who is believed to be the murderer of her? Well, Ben Affleck. Even though we don't have a body, the country has already turned on Ben Affleck, and we are following around his story as he tries to uncover what really happened to his wife. And this movie takes place in the suburbs. It's just one of those movies it's really flipping the media upside down, and how media covers these kinds of subjects, how we could turn on somebody even if they're innocent. Just the fact that there is enough evidence there to make us think that this guy is guilty, even if we don't have any hard proof that he is. And it also turns into a real psychological thriller about halfway through this movie. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, when we find out that Rosamund Pike's character actually faked this whole thing to really get back at her husband. And that, I mean, if you read the book, you already knew this was coming, but I remember being in theaters and just being shocked. I didn't think that this is the kind of movie we're getting. And then Rosamund Pike just, after that, turns in one of the best performances that you'll ever see. She never really got to capitalize on this. I think Rosamund Pike is a very underrated actress. I thought this was going to lead to way more roles. You know, I felt like she had a big gap. You know, a lot of people knew her from the James Bond movie back in 2002. I think it was Die Another Day she was in, but don't quote me on that. I thought she was going to have a way longer career than she did. Like, she still makes movies, but, you know, she reached this high with Gone Girl. Like, she was the standout performance in this. Ben Affleck turns in a great performance as well, but she stole the show. And this movie was violent. It was crazy. It told an amazing story. I know that this is my wife's favorite David Fincher movie. You know, my only complaint with this movie, and it's just casting of Neil Patrick Harris. It feels just very miscast. It just doesn't work for me. I'm a big How I Met Your Mother fan, so maybe that's a personal thing. I just can't take him seriously when he's not doing comedic roles. So I felt like a better choice of actor, but he plays such a pivotal part in the climax of this movie. You know, it kind of takes me out of it at some points, and I think that's what kind of affects it rising up this list a little bit more, but it's still a really good film. It's his number 6 movie for a reason, because I think it's still a phenomenal movie, and as always with all his movies, great production design. So definitely check out Gone Girl if you haven't seen this one.
Only on the outside.
And at number 5 is one that I have only just seen for the first time basically a few days ago, and that is The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, starring Brad Pitt and Cate Blanchett, Tilda Swinton. There's a lot of great actors. Taja P. Henson. There's so many. Oh, and there's also a very young Mahershala Ali in this movie in a very small role before he really took off thanks to Luke Cage. But he's in this movie and he does a pretty damn good job. But the standout performances are obviously Cate Blanchett and Brad Pitt. It's really Brad Pitt's movie. He doesn't turn in the best performance, but he does a great job carrying this movie about a man aging in reverse. He basically is born looking like an 80-year-old man, and his own father just disowns him immediately, basically like what the Penguin's dad did, just gets rid of him. And Taja B. Henson's character takes him in and raises him as her own. And, she has a home where she takes in a bunch of elderly people. I guess it's like a hospice care. He was supposed to die. No one knew what condition he has. But this movie turns into a very philosophical film. The way he looks at life. The best scene in this movie is his relationship with Tilda Swinton's character. They're having an affair. She's married. He's not. When she finally gets the courage to leave and just go back with her husband, all she leaves is a simple note. And he's not upset about it. He says, "I'm just glad it happened." And that way of looking at life, I'm telling you, it made me so emotional while I was watching it. This movie made me tear up and cry twice. It's a phenomenal film. I feel like with more rewatches of this movie, this will go higher up my list because this is very much my kind of movie. I don't know why it took me so long to finally catch up to this. That is just my fault. There is no reason for that. This movie is just, it's gonna end up being one of my favorites from here. It's kind of a masterpiece, but since I've only seen it one time, I can't rank it any higher. The way this movie looks at life in general, it's almost like this movie came out of the screen to speak to me, and it really was beautiful. I thought this movie was absolutely just phenomenal. I mean, it looks incredible. I'm just still thinking of the shots with the tugboat and the one light with the snow pouring down. Man, what a great movie just throughout. Great special effects. I have almost no complaints about this movie. I'm having a hard time thinking of any, but it's just not fair for me to put this movie any higher when I've only seen it once, and recency bias will tell you that, the movie you've seen the most recent, that's the one that sticks with you the most. This one, not seeing it ever, it really got to me. I love this movie so much. I'm dying to actually run back and rewatch it again. I hope that more people... This movie, for some reason, just doesn't get talked about as much anymore. I've heard people say it's slow. I didn't experience that at all. This movie is basically a 10 out of 10. But again, I've only seen it once, so I can't put it any higher than at number 5.
You guys were the inventors of Facebook? You've invented Facebook. Is there anything that you need to tell me?
And at number 4, you get The Social Network. This is probably his most acclaimed film. It's one of the best looking films. You get Jesse Eisenberg in a great performance. Armie Hammer playing dual roles. Justin Timberlake actually gets a great performance in this one. Dakota Johnson pops up in a small role. So this movie has it all. It's just a phenomenal movie that tells the story of Facebook and the origins of Facebook. Now, I have told people how great this movie is, and this is the reaction I get every single time. The Facebook movie? No, that's not good. I don't want to watch a movie about Facebook. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. It's not just about Facebook. Yes, Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg are the central characters of the movie, but I'm telling you, and I forgot, I didn't even bring him up. Andrew Garfield, this is by far his best performance as well. But yeah, people just will not watch this movie because of the subject of Facebook, and they're missing the entire point. Not only is this a cautionary tale about Facebook, and a cautionary tale about being a genius, how great has this movie aged since all this stuff has happened with Meta and Mark Zuckerberg? This movie has aged phenomenally. People have been asking for a sequel because it would be perfect. The way that this movie ends, it definitely could start another film. That just should tell you how good of a movie this is. Now, I think that this movie has some of the best produced scenes I've ever seen in a film that just really wouldn't be much to think about. Like the opening credits, just him walking through the campus, that's one of the best opening credit scenes that you'll ever see. And I didn't bring it up with the girl with the dragon tattoo, but his opening credit sequences are always usually very phenomenal, and he was inspired by Saul Bass. If you're a fan of the 007 movies, you know that Saul Bass did a lot of those opening credit sequences. So David Fincher tries to put those into all of his movies, and he has some of the best you'll ever see between Seven, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Fight Club. Fight Club is probably the best, but this one is perfect as well. And then the scene, just the rowing scene, like these scenes that should be nothing feel so special because they're in David Fincher's hands, because he just knows how to shoot a scene. There's incredible dialogue in this movie because the script was done by Aaron Sorkin, so it's got that dialogue where everyone's just talking quick, filling in each other's blanks. It's perfect. If you know who Aaron Sorkin is, he writes some of the best movies in history, including A Few Good Men. So that script combined with David Fincher's production and directing, I mean, a masterpiece came out. This is one of his top 4 movies I can interchange at any time because I just love all of them. them. And now number 5 with The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. I think all of his movies from this point on are all masterpieces, all once-a-year watches for me. It's really hard for me to pick a top 4 because I love all these movies almost equally. So it's just, this is kind of the ranking I came up with today because it's too hard. I love all of these movies. And this is actually the only David Fincher movie that has a 4K Blu-ray release, and you have to buy the Columbia Classics Collection Part 2 for that, and which is a real shame because it is a beautiful 4K Blu-ray that I wish everybody could see.
Now I'm up to around 500.
You got 4 crime scenes, not a single usable print.
And then at number 3 we have Zodiac, and this movie stars Robert Downey Jr., Mark Ruffalo, and Jake Gyllenhaal, and they're trying to uncover the Zodiac Killer, one of the most famous serial killers in American history, a crime that still to this day has not been solved. And again, David Fincher tackling a subject that might not interest a lot of people. Yes, the Zodiac Killer is very interesting, but we know how this movie ends. We know that the Zodiac Killer never gets caught. So how do you nail that landing? How do you nail that story when everybody already knows what's going to happen? Well, David Fincher sure knows how to make this movie, and it feels like this is definitely like a prequel to what he would do with Mindhunter. The tone is very similar. It takes place in the 1970s. Beautiful set design, and one of David Fincher's favorite films of all time is All the President's Men, and you could just see that influence when they're in the bullpen. You know, Jake Gyllenhaal, he's just a comic creator, while Robert Downey Jr. gets, you know, he's more of the confident, cocky guy, but yet their stories end very different. I don't want to spoil how they end, but they end very different. You know, Jake Gyllenhaal kind of just becomes obsessed with the Zodiac Killer, and he kind of ropes in Robert Downey Jr. with him. Mark Ruffalo plays this cop who's just also trying to figure this out, and some of these scenes in this movie, the tension is incredible. The scene where the Zodiac Killer ties up the 2 people, and there's just no audio except for, you know, you hear him tying the 2 people up, and then eventually he shoots the gun and the echo effect from the gun. That scene is incredible. David Fincher just knows how to shoot some incredible scenes in his movies that just get you wrapped up and make you feel like the basement scene in this movie. It's one of the most incredible scenes in film history because of the tension that it builds. Like, you feel that up your spine. You're getting chills and goosebumps. And again, we know that that person is more than likely not the Zodiac Killer, and he's not going to kill Jake Gyllenhaal, but because of what he's setting up from a filmmaking standpoint, you feel it. You feel it the entire time, and it's still, every time I watch this movie, it gets me. And that should just tell you how good of a film Zodiac is. Check out Zodiac. And then at number 2 is Fight Club. This one came out back in 1999, has one of the most famous twist endings of all time. I'm going to spoil it here, so if you don't know, Edward Norton and Brad Pitt are playing the exact same character of Tyler Durden. And we find that out at the end. It's basically Edward Norton's character has a split personality disorder. Brad Pitt is who he wants to be, but unfortunately Edward Norton is who he is. And this movie, for a lot of people back in 1999, it was like an adrenaline rush. It was basically like, man, we're just like, oh, we want to have fight clubs, but they really missed the point of what this movie was about. This movie is about toxic masculinity, it's about consumerism, it's about corporations, it's about how they have the influence on humanity, you know, basically talking about how we live for our possessions. Yes, we all believe in freedom, but are we all free? You know, we all have we're all in debt to buying all the material possessions that we want, and that's why the line in this movie when Brad Pitt says, you're not really free until you've lost everything. And that is 100% true, and I feel like a lot of people miss the point of that back in 1999. Thank God that a lot of people have actually started to realize what this movie is really about. And man, a phenomenal film in here. The plane crash scene with the soap is one of my favorite scenes in film history. The buildings exploding at the very end with the Pixies song playing is just an incredible scene as well. You know, the fight scenes are all good and great. I feel like that's what most people took away from this movie, but there is a lot more to it. I mean, again, one of the most beautiful looking films. Actually, this is his most beautiful looking film. It's not the best atmospheric film that he's ever created, but as far as a visual standpoint, this is by far the best. I just think of the scene in the car crash scene in the rain. That scene is gorgeous looking. And Brad Pitt and Edward Norton turn in some phenomenal performance. And hey, they pull a great performance out of one of my favorite singers of all time in Meatloaf. His name was Robert Paulson. So this movie is pretty much a masterpiece. I go back and forth. This one could easily fall to number 4, but could easily go to number 1 after I rewatch it, just because I love this movie. I've seen this. This is probably the movie that I've seen the most from David Fincher. There was a time where everyone just wanted to watch this movie, so I've seen this movie an insane amount of times, but yet somehow it still always works. I still always get wrapped up in the story and the plot, and I always enjoy myself. But obviously, I could highly, highly, highly recommend Fight Club.
There are 7 deadly sins. Gluttony.
You're going to come take a look at this.
Greed.
No one touched.
And now we've made it to my number 1, and I guess it's pretty obvious, but it's 1995's Seven, starring Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. And this movie, it's amazing. The world they created plays such a pivotal part in this movie. It's just as equal of a character as Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. The world is dirty, it's gritty, it's always raining. You know, it just feels like it's filled with the scum of the earth. I remember when the Batman was coming out, people were like, oh, it's just Seven set in the Batman universe. You know what? It pretty much was. The world was very similar. The Gotham City they created in the Batman was very similar to the world in Seven. You know who that worked for? That worked for me. I thought it was incredible. I love that atmosphere. The atmosphere that this movie created, it really does feel like a world that would harbor a serial killer like John Doe does in this movie, played by, again, an actor who's persona non grata now, Kevin Spacey, but he does turn in a phenomenal performance the same year that he did The Usual Suspects, so he was turning out world-class performances. And you know what he was going for, those scenes, some of those scenes, the scene where he was feeding that guy to death is one of the most disgusting scenes ever. And then you get that other scene where the guy basically is the opposite, and he's just there, and he's got the air fresheners. Oh my god, I don't know how you even think that up, and it was incredible. It just made you feel dirty and disgusting, and like this world they created. And then the very end of this movie with, unfortunately, Gwyneth Paltrow's head. What's in the box?
What's in the box? What's in the fucking box?
I mean, come on, that is something that's crossed over in the pop culture since this movie, and that ending that they went for it. It's incredible. I don't know, if I was Brad Pitt, I would have done the exact same thing. I don't know what happens after this movie, but I'm hoping they gave him a break on that, because Kevin Spacey deserved to die for what he did in this movie. You don't take Gwyneth Paltrow's head like that. That's just wrong. And then mail it to him, and she was pregnant. Man, the guy had a set of balls. He deserved to get shot in the head. He knew it was coming. It definitely was warranted, in my opinion. And again, great performance here by Morgan Freeman. One of his best. Morgan Freeman in the mid-90s was firing on all cylinders. This is a year after Shawshank Redemption, so this is probably peak Morgan Freeman. If you haven't seen Seven, definitely check that one out. If you haven't seen any of these films, except for Alien 3, that's probably the closest thing that David Fincher has ever had to a bad movie. And it's not even his fault. After that, once Seven came out, I don't think he's ever missed. The worst you could honestly say for him is that his movie was pretty good. That's it. I think that's the worst you get for David Fincher. You never say bad. You never say, I was bored. Never. It just doesn't happen. David Fincher puts out just some of the best movies you'll ever see, and he continues to do it. We have another movie coming out this year. I believe it's called The Killing with Michael Fassbender, and Michael Fassbender is an underrated actor, and I'm sure, I can guarantee you that David Fincher is going to pull a world-class performance out of him and give us another great film, because the guy just doesn't miss, and he seems like a perfectionist, and I don't think he's going to allow his movies to miss at this point. So I'm looking forward to that. Hopefully you guys enjoyed my list. Just remember that this is my personal rankings and my personal feelings on the film. You might disagree. If you flip my list upside down and you told me that Alien 3 is your favorite and 7 is your least favorite, I would totally support that. I understand film is subjective. This is just how I rank my David Fincher films. Hopefully you enjoyed this list, and if you did, why don't you give us a like on this video, maybe subscribe to the channel, and then after you're done doing all of that, I want you guys to go out in the rain, and I want you to tell all your friends about us. We'll be seeing you around.